You have the power to imagine your world, our world, a world that is full of possibilities. Today, the world that we imagined is actually full of wicked problems. Problems that society has created, and we're constantly looking for solutions to solve these problems. And what do we do when we look for solutions? We volunteer with NGOs, we fund education across the globe, we send $1 across the globe a month to actually feed somebody, the underprivileged perhaps. And we also do our bit for the environment. We try to plant a tree, save a tree, we recycle waste. But have you ever noticed that all we do as human beings is change the world around us, rather than changing ourselves and how we behave? What I'd like to do is to take you on a short little journey of design experiments today that actually lead us to looking at design as not as problem solving and constantly creating products which actually then cushion these problems, but actually to take you on a journey where we move from design innovation to inventing a whole new world of possibilities. So how do we do this, you might ask? Well, we took a bunch of designers and hooked them up with the most unlikely bedfellows, environmental lawyers. Why would we do this? Well, the environment is draped in complexity, and so are the laws. The laws are actually derived from this complexity. But in order to create a law, you need to start generalizing things. You need to start to allow it to apply to other places. And so you pick out only the general things from the laws and the environments, and you don't look at the particular thing or the particular place. Design, on the other hand, allows you to embrace complexity. Unlike law, which starts to fix boundaries and fix things and fix rules and regulations, design actually allows you to see interdependencies across time, space, scale, and practices. It allows you to bring in emotion and feelings, and also understand the complex relationships among things and people and in ecologies. The other thing that design allows you to do is that design starts, when you do design research, it starts to allow you to collect disciplines when you're doing the research or understanding a place and time. It also allows you to bring in different ecologies to think about these things. So this leads us to our first experiment. Our first experiment is really to figure out a way how you can bring design and law together in the first place. So what we did was we looked at trying to use design to demystify the law. We all know how complicated it is to read a legal notice or even just a contract. So what we did was we looked at demystifying the law, and we looked at a very universal kind of law within India. We looked at the Forest Rights Act of India. And we tried to unpack it using design thinking, and applied it to a very particular thing, or two particular things actually in this context. We looked at the Siriska Tiger Reserve and the Kutch landscape, and we worked with two different communities. So the first community we worked with was in Siriska, the Gujar community. This particular group of people actually understand the forests in very different ways. And unfortunately, what they don't have the ability to do is to actually claim their rights within the forest. So our first challenge was to actually figure out a way for them to reclaim their rights. They have age-old access and benefits to the rights in the forest and access land and grazing. So students, design students, worked with the lawyers, and they came up with a paralegal toolkit. One of the components of that paralegal toolkit is an infograph. And this infograph actually allows the community to understand the relationship between rights and their responsibilities within a forest. If they wanted to choose to stay in the forest and claim those rights, they could then figure out what those responsibilities were that came with those rights, and then how to reclaim them through this entire elaborate process of applying for something through the government. Our second part of this particular experiment was to work in the Kutchi landscape. And we worked with the Camel Maldaris. Now this community has something even more particular to it. They're a nomadic pastoralist community, and what they do is they actually follow the camels around. Their entire lives revolve around camels. And what is particular to this community in this context of the Forest Rights Act is that not only did they not know how to reclaim their rights, they actually didn't even know they had rights. So here was our challenge in this case. So again, students and lawyers got together, and they designed a board game. What you see here is a board game of two different pathways, one of the industries that actually function in the Kutch landscape, and the other of the camel maldaris that navigate through this fluid landscape. What this board game allows each of these groups to do, or each of the players to do, is to actually navigate across the board and figure out how to collect evidences with which they can then claim rights. So it teaches them to understand what an evidence is, that they might already have evidence as part of their community, as part of their traditional knowledge, as part of their paperwork. And then what it allows them to do is that when they come into a conflict zone with industry, it allows them to use the right that they have gained to gain access to that particular plot. What is interesting about this particular project, that we actually call the Roots Project because we wanted to go to the root of the problems, is that this is actually not just a game of players that are in the landscape. This is a game of winners and losers. In this particular imagination of our world today, it's a game of power and domination. It's also a game of looking at how one particular group sees the landscape as fixed territories and the other sees them as fluid landscapes. This brings us to our next experiment. When we look at territories themselves, or the act of creating territories, they come with their own stories to tell. And our next contentious landscape that we worked with brought out this particular act of territory creating into a new light. If you were to look at, there was a breakdown in the law itself. Where environmental law could not function, it offered us an opportunity to actually look at how design can be used to revive communities through creative practices and storytelling. And here we looked at transforming communities to enable them to transform themselves rather than the things around them. So imagine a place, imagine a landscape that is fraught with the wake of apartheid. Imagine a landscape where there are 4 teens who grow up in this land of gangs, in a landscape that is governed by the ungoverned. This is the Cape Flats of South Africa. The narratives of these 4 young kids that we sort of proceeded to elaborate on, or actually find a way to structure, it's how they traverse this landscape through the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's monomyth. And the narrative itself has been created by looking at different kinds of subjects or topics or disciplines. We looked at archaeology, we looked at philosophy, psychology, we looked at historical events, and also we worked with the kids themselves in the Cape Flats to figure out what their stories really were. Because here we are sitting in India, working in South Africa. We needed to really know what life was like there. And what actually happened was we came up with a whole bunch of narratives along the hero's journey itself. And every hero's journey has different characters and has different levels of characters and particular types. And our 4 characters are really based on the Jungian archetypes. So I'm going to walk you through them. And our first character is Leo. He is strong and impulsive and arrogant, and his spirit animal is the lion. Now in Khoisan mythology, which is the First Nations people of South Africa, the Khoisan community, in their mythology, there's always a spirit animal. Everyone has one. So Leo's spirit animal is the lion. And then there's Jackie. She's the lover and the most caring, but sometimes suffocating when you get too loving and caring. And her spirit animal is the jackal. There is also Bobby. Bobby is naughty, unpredictable, and his spirit animal is the baboon. Now, these spirit animals actually help the kids in their journeys to sort of overcome their challenges and allow them to see things that they wouldn't normally see in their real lives. And there's also a 4th character. There's Eli. Eli's spirit animal is the eland. This is the rain animal in Khoisan mythology, which is the most spiritually potent of all of them. And we know that every hero's journey must have a guide. So our guide here is not Obi-Wan Kenobi or Master Shifu, but we have a guy called Sharp, whose spirit animal is a shape-shifting mantis. The wonderful thing about narratives is that you can structure everything on a plot. All the different elements, you can put it on a plot. And this is a plot of the hero's journey, or the multiple hero's journey, this particular comic book series. If you look at the plot itself as just a visual, not to worry about the story, and you just watch the line, you can extend the line across. You can extend it both ways. You can actually thicken it, and you can see the multiple layers. You can add stories upon stories and build multiple layers of the interactions between them. And the other thing you can also do is that you can diverge the narrative and converge. But what you don't see in this plot is the ability for something new to emerge, your imagination, to be able to imagine new things along the plot. So this leads me to our next experiment. Our next experiment is really to move from a space where design is used to create stories, to revive communities. But what design actually does through this graphic narrative is to open up the possibilities. The design is actually a changer. It allows you to imagine new things, new stories, new pathways, and new plots. The agent of change is the reader. It's you. You have the agency to make the change or create a new narrative. So our next experiment is to move from innovation to imagining new plots. And here we're going to look at, not looking at something from the universal to a particular, but we're going to try and look at a very particular thing and derive a universal from it. So we're looking at designing a whole new imagination. Now, some of you might have been to the Western Ghats region of India. Do you even know where it begins when you're driving or flying there? Do you know where the city ends and where the forest begins? The Western Ghats and other regions in this world are all seen as maps and zones and with all these boundaries and lines around them. But what you really don't see is these lines. When you're actually traversing the landscape, the lines are blurry, they don't even exist. So we decided to look at the plot to find new ways of seeing the landscape that can actually look at the diversity and the complexity and the simultaneity of things that happen across the landscape, and not to take anything for granted. So there were 7 ways that we looked at at a plot and looked at the Western Ghats itself, but I'm going to take you through the last one on this list. These are maps of the Malabar coast. They're old maps, all the way from the Portuguese and how they mapped it. Maps are wonderful ways and very, very powerful ways of understanding a landscape. It gives us a lot of information that we see using our eyes, and we see how territories and boundaries are all created, and where places are, and how to get there, and how to get away from it. But what we looked at was that the map is actually a very static thing. There are lines on this. We don't see the dynamic relationships across space and time. So we looked at a very particular thing in the landscape. A bunch of design students looked at the coconut fruit and its plant and all its forms and uses. And what they did was they actually decided to look at every single use and its transformations. They looked at how the coconut transforms from the seed all the way to the fruit, and then how the fruit is used and all its different parts are used, and they plotted out the different transformations. They invented a plot for the coconut. And from this invention of a plot, they took this plot to the Western Ghats region and started to lay out all the other transformations that they saw in the Ghats. And then what this did was, we no longer see the Western Ghats or the Malabar coast as a single line or looking at different ways of drawing lines, but they see it as a shifting line. Depending on the particular transformation you look at, or the agent of the transformation, you can map a whole new Western Ghats, or the coast of the Malabar itself. Maybe you've all been to the beach at some point, and you know that when you're standing there on the water with your toes in, the line between the water and the sand is always shifting. And this is the power of the temporality that we want to sort of explore. So, what does this tell us? That a plot is a very powerful instrument. That if you can imagine a new plot based on something very particular, you can actually navigate a landscape with a greater sensibility and negotiate the temporality with much more sensitivity. You have the power to imagine a new world, our world, a different world, not full of wicked problems, but full of possibilities. Thank you.